Travel is something we all enjoy and look forward to. But the modern idea of travel is very different from most of the ancient history. For one thing, there was no transport. So most of the time, you were traveling either on foot or some other mammal. So people didn't really travel as much as we do. But those who did, they really traveled far, across countries and continents. And that's why I'm going to talk about the travels of Ibn Battutah. Now, you might have heard the name. This 14th century Moroccan has quite a legacy in the popular culture. But I'm sure you don't know a lot of things about him, unless, of course, you've specifically read his works, which is exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about the travels of Ibn Battutah, his journey, most of which he himself documented, and of course, there were some fictional accounts, fictional stories in between, but historians have been able to figure out those stories which were fictional, and they have published his works in sort of abridged versions. So I picked this book. It's called The Travels of Ibn Battutah, edited by Tim McIntosh Smith. It's another abridged version where they have edited out certain things which they feel were not really true. But most of the travels were absolutely true. His experiences were real. And he traveled from Africa to Middle East and then India and China and then all the way back home. He was a Moroccan, as I said, and the idea at that time was that if you want to make a name, then go towards the east. It's an exotic place, and he took it quite literally. So let's start his journey. He was born in a place called Tangier, Morocco, in 1304. When he was 21, he left his home to visit Mecca and, of course, Medina. He was a religious scholar after all. He was a Qazi. Qazi, it means some kind of judge in a Sharia court. So that was his profession. So he starts his journey with a donkey. And just a few days later, he confronts really bad fever. But he has his faith. After all, he was going to Mecca. So he told himself, if God has decided that my death would be on the road, so be it. I will die with my face towards Mecca. There were some people around him who looked after him, and at the same time they encouraged him to sell some of his stuff, including that donkey. And he followed their advice. He borrowed some stuff from these people. At the same time, they looked after him, and that was when, probably for the first time, he fell in love with a woman. And as you would see in his journey, he got married, and that was the first occasion. And after that, he kept getting married and divorced multiple times throughout his journey. So that's what happened in this case. He fell in love, he got married, signed a contract, and then signed divorce papers. And he moved on. Interestingly, when you read his writings, you find that wherever he's going, he's constantly recounting about all the things that writers and poets had said about those places. And then he is meeting people who are asking him to go to India and China, where these people are claiming that they have their relatives, they have their friends. So there was this flow of communication, there was this travel that was happening even at that time. So he continues his journey through Egypt as he looks at the Nile River and the pyramids with amazement. He's still focusing on his religious journey, but slowly he's getting his ideas about moving towards India, and that dream is brewing. Now he enters Syria and talks about visiting Gaza as well. He says it's such a small town, but with great distinction and shining splendors. It's pleasant in outward experience and an admirable sense of inner quality. That's something I personally enjoy when you see a historical figure describing a historical place, but the place has changed so much in our times. Anyway, it's worth mentioning here that wherever Ibn Battutah is going, he's meeting Islamic scholars, he's growing his network, and at the same time he's working as a qazi. And as it was a part of tradition those days, all the rulers and all the elite class, they were very nice to pilgrims and often offered them many gifts. So that was going smoothly for him. Finally, after traveling for many months, he reaches Mecca. He's a religious man after all, and he's in complete awe of the place. It means so much to him. This was where Islam began. This was where Prophet Muhammad lived. He can't even describe what he feels. It's a really spiritual experience. But he knows he has to keep going. He knows he has to go to India. The dreams are too big now. He can't go back. He doesn't want to. He just wants to keep going in the east. So he keeps moving, spends the next couple of years in southern Persia and Iraq. And then he makes another Hajj to Mecca and on to Arabia towards Asia. He goes on. At first, he had hoped that he would sail to India on a ship, but there was no companion and there was no ship. So he waited. He waited for 40 days to be precise. And then there arrived a ship in a really bad condition. Ibn Battutah didn't like it at all, and he refused to go with it. And as it turned out, a few days later, the same ship foundered, and most of the people in it, they all died. And Ibn Battutah, who never sailed that ship, he was on the road. When he was in Constantinople, as Istanbul, as we know it better, he did not like it much. He says a few nice things here and there, but then he also calls it filthy. He likes the idea of some secularism there and talks about Hagia Sophia. But then he still has his reservations. Here's this another interesting aspect of a historical figure looking at a city from a completely different perspective. Anyway, through Central Asia, he journeys towards Afghanistan where he finds cold mountains, almost like deserts, and they do not impress him. As soon as he enters India or Sindh, he is surprised. He is surprised to see how much Islamic culture has changed here. And in fact, he is all the more surprised to see some people known as Hindus. Who were these people? Why were they burning their dead bodies? All these things were beyond his comprehension. But he had one idea. He knew he had to go to Delhi or Dilli, and he had to meet Muhammad bin Tughlaq, the emperor of those times. It wasn't a new thing for Ibn Battutah. Throughout his journey, he was meeting kings and elites, and that's how he was making money. And he was getting married and divorced and moving on. Not to forget that at certain points he was also carrying slaves or sex slaves, but one of the slaves kept running away and then he kept finding him. So that's how his journey was going on. He wasn't all alone throughout this journey. In fact, on most occasions he kept finding different groups of people and kept moving from city to city. But coming back to his cultural shocks, he was surprised to find that some Muslims drank wine here. Some women had really different statuses in Asian cultures, and they were in powers too, something Ibn Battutah hadn't seen back home in Africa. So he got in touch with Muhammad bin Tughlaq and signed a contract with him as he became the Qazi of Delhi. At that time, he had only heard really good things about Tughlaq, but soon he would find out that he's a mad king who was doing all kind of crazy experiments with economy, religion, society. He wasn't really popular with people, and there were many uprisings against him. And to put it more mildly, he was a bit of psychopath. It all depended on his mood. Sometimes he would just execute people or torture them for no reason, put really red hot iron bars on the chest of those people and then rip them off. Some of these descriptions are really horrible. In fact, on some occasions, he would also throw these people under some huge animals or elephants. As Ibn Battutah spent some time in Delhi, he knows that he has to escape. This is definitely not the place and definitely not the emperor he wants to work with. He felt nostalgic for Mecca and he wanted to go back. But then there was just one strange demand from Muhammad bin Tughlaq. He asked Ibn Battutah to accompany him to China. And he couldn't say no. Nobody could say no to Tughlaq. So he agreed and joined the caravan. But somehow he got separated and he was lost. And he was all alone with people who wouldn't understand a single word of his language. Those people found him and were almost there. They were going to execute him, but he escaped. And then eventually, through some kind of struggle, he found his caravan. And then he traveled to Calicut, from where he was supposed to ship to China. Those ships were really luxurious. But once again, he had his bad luck. He wasn't offered a nice room, about which he got really pissed. And he decided he won't go in the ship unless they offered him a nice room. And when all this was going on, he missed the ship. And then he didn't know what to do. He didn't want to go back to Delhi because he knew that the emperor would be pissed. So instead, he thought, I would take a different route. And he traveled to Maldives Islands, took a job of a Qazi, and then got married once again. He was enforcing Sharia law there. He was happy to do that. But as you know, he wasn't supposed to live in one place for too long. Eventually, in 1346, he found China. China, according to him, was beautiful, but that did not really please him. Well, there was no Islam. And these people were really strange. They spoke different language, they had different cultures. So he didn't feel like going outside. And most of the time when he was there, he stayed indoors. And then during that time, there arrived the Black Plague. And it was everywhere. People were dying. Hundreds and thousands of people were dying every day. And this was all around him. Something we are noticing these days during Corona times. So Ibn Battutah struggled with this. He didn't know what to do. But he knew one thing, that somehow he had seen the end of the boundary of the Islamic Empire, and he didn't want to go any further. He had to go back. He had to visit his home once again. So eventually, after 24 long years, he got back home. When he left, he had thought that it would be just around 2 years. But 24 years had passed. 10 marriages had happened and ended. So when he eventually made it home, he found that his mother had died. And the society, the people in general, they were really eager to hear his stories. So they encouraged him to tell his stories, and he worked with a writer who helped him document his travels. As I said, some of those travels might have been fictional, so most of them have been removed from these abridged versions of the book. Those accounts also you can find in some of the books. But it definitely was a wonderful, wonderful journey, and probably a wonderful life for one to travel on his own and to be without home, as they say, like a rolling stone.